Good morning. This is WIOX. You're listening to The Other Future. I'm your host, Terry Tapp. And we bring the show to you every other Thursday morning from 9 to 10 a.m. And I'm pretty much focused on people in the arts or people doing activist work, projects like that, things that you don't see in on the corporate screens that are pushed in our faces every day. My guest is today Mike Watson. He's a returning guest. Mike is an author, is an art critic and theorist. He's a curator, and he's got two books out, one which just was released, both from Zero Books. One is Toward a Conceptual Militancy. His book, which has just been released, is called Can the Left Learn to Meme? When I had Mike on last time, we finished the hour on a cliffhanger, on the beginning of a discussion that I wanted to continue with him. And Mike covers in his books quite a few topics that we could have many hours of discussion on. But in particular, I wanted to pick up where we had stopped with this idea of given the kind of freedom that we seem to have through our technology, in particular through our communications technologies, we seem to be wasting it. And that is the operative intro question for today's show. Mike, are you with us?
Hey, hi.
Hey,
Can
how
you
are
hear
you
me?
doing? Yeah, thank you for getting... Well, it's not getting up early. You're in Helsinki, correct?
Yeah, so here it's 4 p.m.
Oh.
Not too late.
Right. It's people on the west coast of the U.S. that have joined me at 6 a.m. their time and things.
Okay, well, thank you, yeah. If you have done that, thanks.
So I saw a couple of interviews with you on Twitch, I believe was one. Some stuff that's coming out now, I guess, as your book has been released. What sort of feedback are you getting?
Well, actually, the book, I don't know about that. It's released officially on the 29th of November.
Oh, I thought it
seems to have been released early in Italy. Maybe copies will be going out in the US early, I'm not sure. But the actual official release date is the 29th. But the feedback is coming in because it's been released in some countries and because we've been doing a lot of promo and people have been reading it, journalists and things. So there is some feedback.
How would you characterize that? Just go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, people seem, at the moment, I mean, it's early days, but people seem quite happy. But I think the thing the book does is it presents, it kind of approaches everything as kind of terribly negative as it kind of sometimes seems, but it gives a kind of way out, or at least it says, well, okay, we're really in trouble, but we still have this capacity to create. Maybe it's never before that we're incredibly productive culture in terms of cultural productivity.
Yeah, and that's something I took from my reading of your work, and also from our last discussion. I don't know if it's from drinking maybe too much coffee or just metabolism in general, but I tend to stay optimistic, and it's potentially delusional. But like you said, even though things are very grim, we have these tools to combat them. And in terms of our media, we have tools to combat ideologically a lot of takes on current events, on our politics and things that I'm shocked that we're not using differently. And I look to you as someone who is examining the kind of messy way that the internet is potentially approaching the problem of using things, using our communications technologies to push back against a very dark, grim narrative. And so I do think that there is that hope. But when we talked last time, we had led up to this moment of. You said we both concurred about the promise of the internet. Those early days of the public version of the internet in the early '90s, when it seemed to be a democratizing force, and now you have cat memes. You have it's a lot of it is just ridiculous. Can you take that and I give you the floor on that? What do you think?
Yeah. That's certainly something I go into in the book and generally in my thinking and other projects I engage in as a curator and sometimes as a kind of live video maker or YouTube video maker. There's this terrific potential, but it's somehow blighted, and I think that's kind of very, very Adornian, as the book looks at this theorist who was operative and died in the last century. He lived up to 1969. Theodore Adorno. What Adorno had was kind of this incredible capacity to kind of root any possible way out that we might have, and by that I mean out of like the worst excesses of at that point late capitalist society, what we called late capitalist, kind of late industrial capitalist society, to root any way out within that same capitalist society, and that was essential for Adorno, as I believe it was for Marx. And the thing with Adorno particularly is he was really interested in this idea of hope, but really careful not to embed hope on any kind of false foundations. So he kind of says, we are pretty much damned. And he was a German Jew exiled during World War II who returned to Germany afterwards. So he lost a lot of associates to the persecution of the Jews. And he really kind of saw things very bleakly, that capital had kind of completely dehumanized us, and that you could see that the kind of that coming to its kind of worst point in the death camps, in the Nazi concentration camps. So he really doesn't want to kind of say like, hey guys, I think we can find a way out. He's very wary of that because he's seen people already do that and it go terribly wrong, whether they be Nazis, fascists from Italy or Soviet communists.
Or marketeers, I thought too. Like when he was in California, he saw the, and I'm just inserting this, but you can return to the narrative. But he saw the same foundation for the Nazi death camps, if I'm not mistaken, in the consumerist marketing in California when he moved to there. Correct?
Yeah, California, and also he worked in Columbia University in New York. And basically, he was kind of, as a European going to America, he was kind of really taken aback at how the Americans were doing very similar things to the fascists in Europe in terms of propaganda, but they were actually selling it as kind of a free choice through Hollywood films, through magazines, etc. So, he sees the same thing happening in kind of ostensibly democratic capitalism. And so he refuses to find a simple way out. So what he says is that we're all doomed, but the very mechanisms that are commodifying us can be used and turned against commodification itself. So for him, the culture industry is a way of commodifying culture. We're commodified in our workplaces. The industrial process kind of turned people in kind of a very kind of early to mid 20th century analogy, kind of turned people into the machines they were operating. And he says that this mechanism by way of which a commodity would claim to have properties in excess of itself. So, you would buy a certain toothpaste because it would make you more attractive to people and so on. Right. He said that the artwork also possesses, but to even more of an extreme. So an artwork, and for him it had to be kind of an unintelligible, abstract artwork, could convey a sense of freedom, could convey a sense of removal from the capitalist system, but only by borrowing that same trick of pretending to be something in excess of itself, in excess of its material parts. So he kind of very cleverly grounds any possibility to transcend capital within capital itself. And I think that's the key today, even, where I think you talk about the internet and how it gives us potentially great freedoms, but then we end up kind of not doing anything with it. Well, of course, as I think you would add anyway, and it's kind of implicit in what you said, that the internet, it kind of somehow it offers these freedoms, but at the same time it's taking them from us in terms of the data economy, in terms of the fact that anything we do on the internet, even kind of leftist or anti-capitalist, is making money for that same system. for Google, for Facebook, etc. So the answer would be that no, we're not going to actually get out of the system by literally just getting out of it. We need to somehow leverage something from within the system or hijack it, and then I think we could appeal to the same tools Adorno uses. He says, well, okay, if we can't beat the system, we need to basically copy it somehow. So I think in meme culture, what we see is people who, I think the youth, the younger generation and the older generation, to be fair, we're all very cynical. But we make this stuff, we put this stuff out there in terms of memes, in terms of YouTube videos, and there is this kind of mocking element that I don't think anyone's really thinking it's changing anything in itself, but somehow the sum of all that we're throwing out there maybe can disorientate and somehow challenge the capitalist system. There's a certain rationality, a false rationality to capitalism, which could be inverted through just the kind of chaos and weird stuff that comes up on the internet.
Right. I was thinking of your book, and I was thinking of our discussion the past couple of days. And let me give you a scenario, because I write as well. I write fiction, and of course I paint, and I'm always picking up these scenarios and letting them marinate, in my little brain for a while, and then drawing from them. And let me give you this scenario, because it felt very hopeless, and I haven't processed it yet. But I thought of you and your writing, and I'll disguise some of this because out of respect for the people. But I've been driving for an art delivery, art packaging company. And part of what you do is deliver pieces, move them in between museums. Okay, very, of course, these are expensive pieces, and the crating is very important, and there are all types of laws and restrictions and paperwork on all of this. But also we take artwork that's been bought by very wealthy people and deliver it from the museum to those wealthy people or the gallery. And the past couple of days, I was delivering pieces to very wealthy people. And as I did this, I was walking around an apartment with the owner was there, and we were delivering the piece. And there were some pieces on the wall by various abstract expressionists, American painters from the mid to late 1950s. And the next day, I moved a tribal piece, and the tribal piece, it was gorgeous. But again, there were pieces that were by contemporary artists, and I would see as potentially having a very anti-capitalist message, or at least an anti-consumerist, a challenging message. And I'm in these homes that are opulent, looking at these pieces, and I thought about I don't want to say the artist, but an abstract expressionist from the 1950s, American. And I thought of our discussion of Adorno's Shutter, where, as you're alluding to now, and the shock that can push someone, out of their normal imposed consciousness. I'm putting words that Adorno sometimes wouldn't use, obviously, but I thought of that, and I'm standing in these opulent spaces, a home and an apartment, and the people, one person was present and, having a petulant frenzy because of scheduling and so forth. And it was just depressing in a way, because I thought, as an artist, I can't help but create these things, and they're being acquired, at least in part, by people that are absolutely appearing to commodify them. I didn't get any sense that there was joy in the art, and with the piece we brought up for this person, I didn't get any sense that he was really overwhelmed by having this piece of art and something was uplifted in him. And it really left me with a bad taste. So let me give you that scenario, because I still haven't let it simmer enough. But what's your take on something like that, just even emotionally as much as intellectually?
Yeah. Well, I've had these experiences before, not quite the same. Although I have actually been an art handler at some point, at least as a temporary job.
Sure.
Maybe 15 years ago or so. But I've worked across the spectrum with artists and artworks and collectors and gallerists, and there is something that can be very disheartening about that kind of experience. And I suppose it's because the art world and the artwork, it claims to be something it can never be. It really takes the moral high ground somehow, or even like an amoral or beyond morality kind of position. And this is the whole thing about what Adorno called the autonomy of the artwork, and that's the kind of artwork standing outside society, so it can critique it from afar, and that's actually always false. This is his whole thing of the artwork kind of playing the trick of the commodity, that this claim to be somehow outside and above society isn't true, because artworks are made of materials. You take a painting, you'll be talking about normally canvas, which is basically cotton, oil paint, and wood for the frame, if you made a painting on a canvas. And all of those things are somehow laboured. Okay, so an artwork can never really escape the mechanisms of production or the relations of production. So for Adorno, what actually happens when an artwork temporarily, through its kind of abstraction and its difference from the world, is a sensible removal from the world, when it temporarily kind of gives you a feeling, what he called the shudder, it gives you a feeling, a kind of a temporary shock that makes you realize the false conditions of capitalism. The real moment where this hits in is not in the moment when you're transcendent and you're kind of somehow floating. If you can imagine you're listening to a piece of classical music, or a piece of vaporwave music, or any music which can somehow kind of like get you in that drifting kind of state. That point when you kind of forget the false boundaries between yourself and nature, as Adorno would put it, or yourself and the object, the natural object. That point isn't really the useful point. The useful point is when suddenly you're brought out of that moment and you return to reality, because you have to return, because we as human subjects are always kind of separating ourselves out from the natural object, and it's kind of it's a necessity to even have a personality, and this is reflected also in the psychology of various psychologists.
Right.
You'll snap out of that moment of temporary seeming transcendence, and then you realise that actually the artwork was only given to you on a material basis. So you're looking at a painting, say, and then you're kind of drifting, and then maybe you get interrupted by the gallery assistant or some kind of background noise, and suddenly, rather than seeing this landscape that you're lost in, you're moved back into yourself with a jolt, and you're looking at a painting on a piece of board or something.
Right.
And Adorno says that's the kind of truth, the moment of truth that the artwork gives, is kind of, well, one, our connectedness with nature, but that only happening on account of our materiality and the materiality of nature, and then you have to kind of confront that in yourself. I'm sorry because I really forget how we got here, but the point I wanted to make is that this is always a fundamentally material experience, and one that happens on account of the conditions of material production.
Right, and we got here because I gave you that scenario of Art Hand.
And yes, okay. So in that sense, okay. So a couple of things. And that's incredibly disappointing. But it is kind of like that is kind of like the honest reality of art. But also for Adorno, like the artwork that could temporarily kind of take you out of the normal conditions of the normal false conditions that capital imposes on us.
Right.
The artwork that could do that has to be something that's radically unintelligible and abstract, and so it has to be something that isn't already known.
Yes.
Okay. So for Adorno, when something is known, it becomes bought up, it becomes commodified in the normal sense of everyday commodities that are bought and sold. So what you're seeing is basically the bog standard everyday relation between an artist and an artwork and a collector and gallerist and whatnot. But I will say that it's something that on times it's caused me to nearly leave the art world, and I keep leaving the art world and still finding myself in it. Just because I was working in it for so long, and I write for a number of magazines and have contacts and kind of get drawn back in to curate things and and what have you. But the thing that led me on to talking about memes and internet culture and internet gaming culture was kind of a huge disappointment with the art world. And I relate to the sense of alienation you had, because I think there is something very emotional in this that...
yes, and it's also that those pieces of abstract expressionism, which could be seen as exemplars of the possibility of, or the foundation of Adorno's Shutter, are locked away in a high-rise in Manhattan, and can't be seen by most people. Most meaning almost everyone, except the people who are invited by this person to come and sit in his apartment and look at these. Actually, two of them were right by the dining table, so if you're invited to have supper with him, you could look at those. But otherwise, they're tucked away. And I realize this is more art handling talk, but also, the tribal piece that I took. It was interesting because the owner wasn't there, and we sat with the piece. The piece was intended to terrify people. And it's a large piece, and you could see, given the, like I say, I'm keeping the details. I like the people who own the company, so I respectfully not say it anymore, but it was meant to terrify an audience. And so it's basically a meme, in a way, of a pre-digital generation, actually probably about 200 years ago, given where it's coming from. But it was a meme, and it's meant to convey this kind of terrifying Wizard of Oz presence to the plebes, to the workers, to the people who are going to, whatever you're going to do, defend the tribal land or pick food or farm, whatever, or at least not attack the chieftain. And so as we're waiting for the owners, and we're going through the rituals of the logistics of how to deliver the piece, there's a woman there who is a landscaper, and then my fellow worker who's delivering it with me, and we're discussing the fact that this is a not prehistoric but pre digital meme. This is something that you're used to terrify the workers, essentially, and it just reflects on this whole situation. The owner wanted basically to put it in the garage, which is so disrespectful for the crafting of the piece, even. And it reflects back to, the abstract expressionist pieces in the living room of a billionaire, and the fact that they're tucked away. It's a moment in which it really seems to me, maybe as a kind of nascent, as an entry into this thinking, reflect on the term poetic terrorism and what that was intended to be. You're acquainted with that term, correct?
I don't know. In that context, maybe you can explain.
It was an idea that was put forth by Hakim Bey, Peter Lambert Wilson, in his book Taz, Temporary Autonomous Zones, back in the 90s. Actually, the book covers a period from like 86 to 91. And he was, as a writer, and he actually been studying in Iran and things like this, but he knew the entire, modernist, pre-modernist, what we now call continental history, the Proudhon, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, and so forth, that line of reasoning, and into the Frankfurt School with Adorno. And he thought that we need to really be thinking of creating works of art that were not only allowing for this possibility of moving away from the known, so that you're shocked, you feel this pull away from this preconception of your life and as it is structured by capitalism, by consumerism, and so forth, but that you could actually have something that is almost a crime to create. And he gave examples of things. They're very limited, but the idea is still pregnant with me. And I was reflecting on that with my friend, my fellow worker in the truck driving back. Just the fact that, you have this terrible thing, not terrible, awful, but terror-inspiring, as the French say, terrible, amazing thing that we delivered, and it's lost its amazingness by being shoved away in a garage of a billionaire. So what could we do that would have any effect that couldn't immediately be put in a crate and delivered to a billionaire. And that's like, he was talking about things like having dance parties in all-night banking lobbies, and kidnapping people and treating them to these plays and things. I mean, it's stuff that it's inherently ridiculous because it's so far out of anyone's idea of art and legality and expectation. But it could be it's an idea that almost to me, in my brain at least, begs to be explored.
Yeah, I mean, there have been, as you know, various historical moments or art historical moments that have toyed with these kind of spectacles that are supposed to unnerve people or aggressively expose the wrongdoings of I guess always capitalist culture, but even pre-capitalism there were movements in the Middle Ages, like the levelers,
right.
the diggers, various movements in England that seem really, if you read about them, really close to the hippie movements and the punk movements, and before that the Dadaist and Surrealist movements. I mean, I think this could be effective to some degree. I mean, spectacles and happenings and kind of like, you know, bizarre occurrences that happen unexpectedly that could, in a kind of almost hypnotic way, could jolt people out of their complacency and lead them to become perhaps more political or more radical. And this is what obviously will be on your mind. This is what acid communism points to.
Yes.
This movement, this term coined by Mark Fisher, I believe, in conversation with other people, but then he was writing a book on it when he left us, committed suicide as it was in 2017. And then other people are kind of taking up the mantle, but you know, it's kind of very interesting because it is kind of growing as an online movement of people who kind of are looking at each other and saying, you know, what would this acid communism be? And sometimes it's kind of encouraging, and sometimes it's kind of worrying where it might go, because there's a lot of people involved who are kind of edgelords, kind of, you know, online. They use the acid communism, the acid part, as a kind of excuse to not have any kind of sensible program, and maybe just to say dumb stuff. But then there's another aspect that aesthetically is very interesting, using the kind of what's evoked by the idea of acid and the hippie movement, and combining that with Marx. I think it still needs direction, but I mean, that would be a movement that could grow. And I'm just thinking about this because I'm working a bit with Momentum, the campaign group who campaign for Labour in the UK, who are working very hard for the UK election. I'm kind of, because I'm in Finland, and I'm kind of deeply concerned about the way politics is going in the UK, where I come from. I've been in their online forums where they organise people remotely to do things like do research, conservative Twitter accounts. I'm actually making a video about one of their hashtag campaigns that has people making simple selfie videos about their experiences and telling people why they're voting Labour.
Right.
But what they also do is they have these online forums and they say, like, we need to go to this district because that's a constituency that is very borderline and we could swing it towards Labour. And then that way we'd have more seats and we could win the election. It's a bit similar to how the presidential election system works, I think. And so I'm just thinking, like, you know, could one use online forums to mobilize happenings?
Right.
To mobilize, like, you know, let's have, like, happenings across the whole of the UK and America on this date, and we can call it acid communist or acid left, or we don't have to call it anything, but it would be one way, because we don't have, like, a strong countercultural movement, which is what Fisher was addressing with acid communism.
And I guess
we have the means to make one like never before. Although, of course, you know, there are certain things in place in terms of law in the UK and possibly the US that make it actually a little bit more difficult. But I think this idea of dispersal, where you have lots of small groups of people doing something, gets around some of the laws in the UK that would prohibit having large-scale rave parties. So I think there is a potential for that, and I don't see, you know, I think we should probably do it soon, you know, as you're involved a bit in this acid communism and we know other people. But I think one has to also bear in mind the reach of this. How far can we go with something called acid communism and spectacles that are supposed to slightly unnerve people? Because a good deal of the population are actually much more unnerved already than we are.
Yes.
You see what I mean?
And
so they need kind of comforting more rather than disturbing more.
Yeah, I was thinking more rather than shocking people, which was this trick that the self-described, self-designated, and sometimes accurately described avant-garde has played with polite society. I was actually thinking the reverse, which is an expression of solidarity and intrigue, interest in your daily life that doesn't titillate people in the way of, I hate the term pro-grabbing, but it fits with this, but the shock of polite society, but actually reawakens or awakens us to something else. It's, I guess when you were saying happening, creating a happening, I'm almost thinking of art that creates a happening, and the happening is a revolution. As silly as that makes me sound in that context, but if we, I was on this program Monday night, and I was being interviewed kind of as I don't want to say token leftist, but kind of the left presence on a long-term program, and it's my second time on there. I introduced, since a lot of the listeners are right-wing leaning and libertarian, I introduced a discussion, a very, very intellectually conservative discussion on the difference between socialism and capitalism, and it was, like I said, very conservative because these are just textbook definitions pre-Reagan in the United States of what these systems, economic and social systems, involved, political systems. And as I was talking about it, and the guy mentioned the American left and so-called the millennials, Generation Z, or whatever we're calling younger people now, those people aren't socialist, and they have no idea what socialism. Most have no idea, at least in the public sphere, other than a reasonable demand within capitalism for their education to be taken care of by their tax dollars, or their health care to be paid for by their tax dollars, instead of simply given to the wealthy. And I realized then, we're so far from being able to use our technologies to educate ourselves, because in the now almost 3 decades, well, it is 3 decades since the public internet, we've only moved the public to the point of having conservative, reasonable demands. Conservative meaning they're not politically radical. They just want the same thing almost everyone else in the industrialized world has. And I'm a little shocked by that. It seems like we could move that dial further. And as you said, people should be upset. I mean, with climate change, for instance, the dial needs to be moved soon. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, how far can we go on this, and how could we speed it up?
I have this kind of conversation with people lately. I'm having this conversation. I have a friend, artist working in the UK, who calls himself a communist, and I think recently he posted something on Facebook, and it kind of just was like an ongoing. It was kind of an example of how we've been disagreeing actually for a few years. He kind of says, well, there's this election, there's Corbyn running, everyone's excited about Corbyn, but the politics isn't only for elections, and we need to build a sustained grassroots communist movement, and I agree I can see where he's coming from. I agree with that to a large extent, but it seems like there are some people who, where they say that their everyday practice as an activist, it could be an artist activist, involves building a grassroots movement which is different from the electoral system. Right now, that grassroots movement has to be about the election. And if it isn't, because people are like, oh no, but Corbyn's not going far enough, they're throwing away an opportunity to get somebody in power who's the first person in living memory, first Labour politician, well, in my living memory, and I'm 40, who says literally he's a socialist with a socialist program, who today unveiled a manifesto where he literally said that, we are against the rich, and the rich hate us because they know that we're coming after them. And that kind of language hasn't been used. I mean, that's a language that people are dreaming of, and that's a language that I imagine that a communist would want a communist to use who was running for power. So I think it's kind of a shame that some of the far left aren't able to get behind Corbyn, and in that sense that they're kind of every day helping people, and there's this grassroots approach of going talking to people in the communities, helping them with whatever there's, their housing campaign, health campaign, giving them practical advice. And this is like the non-doctrinal approach, which I think is great. But then when the election comes along, and then you then say you're going to ignore the election because you only believe in that approach, that then becomes a doctrine.
Right.
So I think, to be honest, I think this is marginal now, because I think everyone just wants to get rid of the Conservatives in the UK who's left. But in general, following the left since I was in I guess around 16, 17, I've always found this kind of like infighting where it becomes about who's the best leftist. And someone always saying that they're more left than you, or in today's language, like you're a libtard or a neoliberal,
right,
if you're not basically a Stalinist. And this is kind of damaging. And in answer to your actual question, how far can we push this with young people? I think it's really amazing what's happening with Sanders, with Ocasio-Cortez, and you'll know many more American names on the left than that.
There are many. Actually, there are about 5, actually.
Okay. So it's basically Sanders and the 4 that Trump told to go home or something.
Yes.
When they're already in American.
Pretty much.
So it's good anyway that there's 5. And in the UK, there's now Corbyn, and there's people around him like John McDonnell, and they have a very, they have a platform. I mean, Corbyn's been listened to on the news and is saying things on the news that would have been considered outrageous even a couple of years ago when he was, in any case, leader of the Labour Party. I think for now we have to get people looking at that.
Right.
But then you're saying, well, they're doing it because all they can see is like they could get free education, or their tuition fees written off, or whatever would happen. I think maybe that's where it's abstract, and young people, but also a lot of older people they don't really know how to connect with people anymore. It's never about meeting somebody and understanding their position. And
a lot of older people. This is my, of course, sloppy generalized take on it, but especially that generational block in the U.S. that we call baby boomers, and I don't like splitting people up, by age or by race and so forth. It's really against my overall goals. But that general block of people benefited quite a bit from the post-war boom in the United States. They benefited from ample jobs, essentially unionized jobs. A lot of the efforts of people before World War II to change the American economy and change the American political landscape. And I think that they've kind of grown fat and sassy in the sense that they don't understand what anyone in age below them has been dealing with. And now that you have the kind of income inequality which would make a king blush, and you have climate change bearing down upon us, I don't think they get that kind of pressing anxiety that a younger person or an older person should feel, but a younger person has to feel. And so there is a real division there between the politics. There are a lot of people in the U.S., if you look at polls, that would prefer a Biden. Because they know he's an established commodity. Their racism is pretty much background and has benefited them, and so has Biden's. It's not a neo-Nazi racism, but it's the standard American, card-carrying racism. And they're not comfortable with a lot of change because they're worried about their retirement. They're worried about their continuing their lifestyles. On that note, I want to ask you a question, which I want to give you time to answer because I thought you would be an excellent candidate to propose this to. When I was on the show Monday, and I was trying to explain, and I took this into talking with a fellow worker the other day driving the truck. there's this break of this idea of the left. You know, when you have younger people making these extraordinarily conservative and yet reasonable demands of use my tax dollars for my education. I hate calling it free education because it's definitely not. The tax breaks for the wealthy are not free. We pay for those as well. But you use my tax dollars to pay for my health care, pay for my education. Those demands are they're breadcrumb demands. They're minuscule. And in explaining to people what the left is, to me, that's not the left. The left is a very definite thing. And this gentleman I was talking with about the art handling, he studied with Zizek. You know, he studied with Sever Lotringer. He's an extremely erudite person concerning these matters. And he was explaining to me, he's been an activist for quite a while, how people, I guess he's in his early 30s, how people in their 20s now and in his age group define the left. And it's not how I would define it. And I tried to do that on the radio program. When you're talking to people about the left, what is it to them and what is it to you? And I hate these kind of elevator pitches, but how would you define it?
Well, I mean, to me, when I hear about the left and people saying what it is, it's often on the news. I'm normally following the UK news. Although I'm obviously following what's happening in America, Finland. I used to live in Italy, so a little bit in Italy as well. But when I'm watching every day, as I do, the UK news, there is talk about wealth redistribution, and this being a potentially bad thing, or this general notion of like the left taken to an extreme. They want everyone to have the same, and people not to get what they deserve from working hard. And to me, that's a big mistake, and it's put the wrong way round. So I'd rather not focus on the wealth redistribution, which of course is necessary for the thing that I'm more interested in. So to explain that, what I'm more interested in is equality of opportunity. It's basically the idea that anybody can make something of themselves. Anybody who has a talent can use it, or even people can discover talents they might otherwise not discover.
Right.
Such that the greatest opera singer of this century may be residing somewhere in a how would you call it in America, like a council estate in a kind of in a poor area. How would you say this in America? Yeah, government housing. Somebody who it could be an immigrant, could be a recent immigrant, no prospects, parents with no work. But if they're given the opportunity, they may be a great opera singer or sportsman or rap star, or they might win the esports gaming competition. And in rolling out those opportunities for everyone, the actual whole standard will rise, and that's across everything. It could be science, it could be economics. So there's I think this is the thing that, for one, is most useful for people generally because it helps them develop who they are, and secondly is most useful for society in terms of talking about what the left could achieve. Because the right wing will say, well, okay, but if you give everyone like the same, then there won't be competition and people won't rise up, and you won't get the greatest standing out and kind of pulling society ahead behind them. This kind of trickle down effect. You won't have that anymore. But the thing is, actually, we could have that even more. We could have even more, or not that, but even more possibility to find the great people who will help society develop. And to do that, of course, you will need wealth redistribution because, if you look at it simply, there are a lot of rich people whose children are not very talented, who will put them in riding lessons, piano lessons, whatever they do.
Yes.
You look at a reasonably wealthy demographic, and I've taught at fee-paying universities very wealthy students. I mean, they're getting the opportunity to go ahead in basically every single field. So, I mean, yes, to achieve a situation in which any child has the potential to develop themselves, you would maybe need to take money from the richest and redistribute it down And there's a line here which I often actually get wrong, which study it came from, by Marx. From each according to their ability, to each according to their needs.
Yes.
You know this line. So those who have the ability would be using their ability to give to those who need. But those who need, I think the way to sell it to people who would otherwise not like this idea, it's not necessarily that they need, they can't do anything, they can't work with their hands, whatever, and they need our wealth. But it might be that they need the opportunities to develop the talents that they may have. So yeah, I mean, I like to put it that way around. But I think the wealth redistribution is necessary. But I think it's worth pointing out why it's necessary.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because, again, just to point back to the art handling, which you said you've done as well. So I'm sure you have a similar experience. These people were making demands about delivering things that violated the laws of physics. Meaning you can't fit something of a certain dimension into another freight elevator of a certain dimension. And I was actually talking to my girlfriend about this, and she brought up, she said, these people that are at the top of the economic ladder are not the kind of people, don't have the kind of personalities to get there. They inherited the wealth, and they're not exemplars of what I would consider, or she would consider, I'm assuming you as well, given what you just said, of dynamic, amazing people. It's that ability to adapt, to compromise, to figure out a new solution, which to me exemplifies the entrepreneur, the creator. It's not the person who is, 50 years old and throws a petulant frenzy over not having his demand met exactly when he needs to. That is the sort of open-ended free thinker that could discover new scientific discoveries or new philosophical discoveries, or invent a way of doing something. So we have this a cretinous group at the top of our social ladder, buoyed up by a system of production that allows some people to accumulate that wealth. And if you redistribute that, as you said, what you would do is actually allow those who are able to come forward and really have those talents, abilities, that intelligence to move. There was a story. This is a true story, and I'm probably going to use it in a novel at some point. But a friend of mine from Louisville told me her uncle. She lived in West Louisville. Louisville's very segregated. She's black. Her uncle's black. Was black. He was a janitor, and he actually studied physics extensively. He made this kind of Rube Goldbergian contraption in his basement of levers and pulleys and things, all meant to, from across his entire basement, if he put a ball in a chute, after about 5 minutes of all this mechanical movement, would pull a trigger and blow his brains out. And he did it perfectly. And had diagrams, all this. The waste of that man's life that came from being frustrated by not being able to employ his obvious talents, and that led to this kind of action, is to me indicative of the rot at the core of the system. When you have an imbecile like I hate to even mention him, but Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, clearly cretinous people. Having books ghost written for them and paraded as thinkers, as commentators to whom we should listen, and you have a man like that who wastes his clear abilities in self-destruction. And to me, the giving back, those in need are not necessarily your neighbors; it's a society at large, and what we could benefit from.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Yeah, I think that one of the most disappointing things, and I guess it's in many fields, but we've kind of been working in the arts, and I've worked a bit in academia. Is the fact that so many people in strong positions, in permanent jobs, just aren't that capable.
Yeah.
And they just kind of amble along. And if you're like young and trying to make it, that's incredibly frustrating. but also because those people will try and keep you down. They will try and keep you in your position, often aware that you're more capable. And I've seen this not just with myself, but I guess it's more valid because, I may well say that about myself, but I've seen it, looking at many other people who are disadvantaged. And it really proceeds because, the salaries often aren't that high in these positions. So the people who rise up are those people who don't need the money anyway.
Yes.
Who have maybe rent. They live rent-free because they've inherited, or they have some kind of help. But also because there's a certain temperament that's respected in the arts and academia, kind of a calmness and non-critical stance, which I think comes from having money. I'm quite sure.
Social training.
And if you're like, you may not come from money, so you may be kind of perhaps a little bit anxious, but could we say passionate, trying to get where you want to get. You feel it deeply, and many people in the arts are kind of left or liberal left,
right.
But they don't feel it with the passion. So then you get people like us, maybe, who can come across as vulgar.
Yeah.
So then you say the wrong thing, or you're too needy, or you're too direct, and then you never progress and never get given the safe jobs. So I mean, by now I'm like, I've done some interesting things in the art world. I had to fight really hard. I don't really have any money right now, any savings, but that goes up and down. I think things will come back. But I've done something, and there's some people who know who I am, and then I get some small level of respect. So I'm not as worried about me now. And also it's like you get to a certain age and you just deal with it, yeah. But I still look at other people and I get angry about their position. So I mean, it's an ongoing struggle that I suppose the only answer is some level of socialism.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a critique of any truly left economic redistributive plan, that you squash our innate drive to excel and you level us out. You have this kind of imposed egalitarianism. But I think that the economic egalitarianism that it's hinted at by redistribution, actually permits scientific, philosophical, creative, humanitarian excellence. And I think that point that you brought up needs to really be trumpeted. I hate that word now too, but but needs to be said more. Because, if you have a society like a lot on the alt-right, if you read some of the people who've gone to meetings, it's a lot of guys, white guys in tech, making sure that people of color and women don't have the opportunity to get in, to create like a shadow back behind the scenes phalanx that prevents them. And, that's because the majority of them are fairly mediocre, and they perform the right social rituals to get into a job. And, I had the same thing. I was, coming from the culture I come from, was somewhat feral, given middle-class society and above. And that's how, these guys would be if they hadn't been sent to the right schools and given the right training. But they don't have the actual ability. And so they're afraid that some woman will come and take their job away, which is a fair fear. That's a reasonable fear. But that should be allowed. So, we should be able to impose a leveling of the field of opportunity, and that's a really strong leftist point. So I like.
Yeah, I mean I think it's something we should push. Yeah, and I think maybe also, I mean, we push it during election time. And America, I mean, you're kind of on an election footing if you're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
But I suppose you have this kind of pre-campaigning part in America where you choose the candidates. But in elections and not in elections, it's something we can push. And then how do we push it? We're not in Parliament or Senate or whatever. How do we as individuals help that process?
Right, and that's
maybe we can make mechanisms to help people who need their foot up. And then there's also just in one's behaviour. I mean, there are people who help me who didn't have to, because a lot of people in the art world, they're like, I've got my job now, I've got my safe position, and they kind of close the door behind them. They're kind of like, they're friendly, they kind of smile, but they're like, go away. where there's very few people that are responsible for kind of bringing up really a lot of other people, like Mark Fisher. He was someone who would speak to anyone, exchange emails. This was prior to the YouTube left, and it was kind of the blogging left, era of the blogging left,
sure,
when a number of philosophers kept their personal philosophical blogs. And he was remarkable for reaching out. So if you emailed him, he would have something to say. Then we ended up dialoguing. Then we met. He came to a conference I ran in Rome. But always just kind of very giving, even though himself was very tired and ground down by the social system.
Right.
There was a guy called Bert Deis, Luxembourgian, who lived in Italy. I think by family probably not terribly poor, but someone his whole life was helping people get a foot up and was always open. So you have those people, and it's those people we need.
Right.
Now,
and on that note, we're out of time, Mike. Unfortunately, again,
okay.
We will have you back on. And that's a wonderful spot to pick it up on. This is The Other Future. You've been listening to it's WIOX. The show is The Other Future. I'm your host, Terry Tapp. My guest this week was Mike Watson. He's an art critic, theorist, writer, curator. Has a lot of interesting things to say. And if you want to explore that, he's got a second book coming out at the end of the month, published by Zero Books. You can investigate. He has a lot of interesting talks online and a lot of articles out that you can, if you type in his name, spelled as it sounds, Mike Watson, you'll find quite a few interesting things. Mike, thank you so much, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk again.
Thank you. Brilliant. Okay, so speak soon.
All right. Yes. You have a good day. Thank you.
Bye-bye. You too.
This has been The Other Future, and we'll actually be back on next week with a Thanksgiving Day program.